the place to start now is the upcoming 20th anniversary of the events and the attacks of 9/11, which will be on Saturday. Uh, I know for everybody who's not in Gen Z, we all have a lot of memories and feelings that we had of that day. Um, could you talk a bit about what you remember of 9/11 and how it impacted you as not only somebody close to New York, not only as somebody who's a Muslim American, a Desi American? Um, how did it impact you, and what do you remember of it?
I mean, I remember it was a Tuesday. It was a beautiful day. The weather was really nice, and I woke up to a phone call telling me that my sister, I think, called me to say that a plane had flown into the World Trade Center. Um, and I just remember, watching it on the news. And I was uptown. I was like on the Upper West Side, and this thing was happening, down in the financial district, and it could have you wouldn't have known. Like on the Upper West Side, it was just this gorgeous, beautiful day. The birds were singing, and it was just like a surreal feeling of being in the same city, but feeling like there was no sense of it. And actually, weirdly enough, I remember just like after the buildings had fallen, um, there was this kind of just shock and stunned and not knowing what to do. And I remember I had an allergist appointment. I had to go see my allergist for my monthly allergy shot. And I thought, well, I guess I'll just do that. That I have an appointment, so I'll just go. And I just remember I couldn't get a cab, and so I decided to just walk through Central Park and walked to the other side, to the east side on Fifth Avenue, and an old friend of mine was riding his bicycle, and he came up to me, and he had his headphones on. I remember, and he took off his headphones, and he was just like, well, no, prior to that, as I got to Fifth Avenue, I looked down, and this was my first indication of it in like in real time, which was that I just looked down Fifth Avenue, and there were just hundreds of people walking up Fifth Avenue covered in dust, and it almost looked like The Walking Dead. Like it was like just they were walking in the middle of the street. The street was closed off, and they were just carrying their, they'd all just come from office buildings. Everything below Midtown was shut down, and so and they were just covered in white and gray dust. And that was my first indication. I was like, oh my God, like, it was a very surreal thing to just see that. And then a friend of mine showed up on a bicycle, and he took off his headphones, and he was like, hey man, how you doing? What's going on? And I was like, what do you mean? What's going on? Like, have you not? And I realized like he had been teaching back to back yoga classes from like 8 o'clock that morning and had just gotten out and had no idea that any of this had happened.
Yep.
And
My mother
and
learned about it. We were sitting. I was in New York City. I was watching from the rooftop of my high school. But my mother learned about it from a phone call from relatives in India,
is that right?
which is part of the
Wow.
surreal thing about being New Yorkers during 9/11. Uh,
Yeah.
but obviously, what followed, of course, uh, beyond the real misery and suffering of thousands of people in New York, uh, was a new geopolitical era that we were kind of thrust into,
Yeah.
uh, and especially in the United States, especially for people who are Muslim American, that came with a lot of ramifications. Could you talk a bit about sort of the advent of the kind of Islamophobia that maybe you didn't experience directly, but that you saw impact a broader community?
Well, I mean, it just became suddenly, I used to do this joke where it was like before 9/11, Americans thought Muslim was a type of cloth. And after that, after 9/11, it became an incredibly dirty word, and it became a dangerous word. And suddenly, like every person who was raised Muslim or came from a Muslim family or suddenly was in this bizarre position where I felt like I personally even felt like that I had to defend this religion that I had just grown up with, and that was just part of my, like my life and my, it was never a political thing to me. It was just my religion and the religion of my parents and my grandparents and all that. And so suddenly it was like I became politicized, and I became like a representative of something, and I wasn't even particularly devout, and never have been really. So it was one of those things where suddenly like I was forced to kind of you know spell out my patriotism and also defend Islam. And I wasn't prepared to do that. I didn't know how to do that. I did it clumsily, and and learned a lot in that process. I just remember it being a time when there were a lot of questions, and then like, why did this happen to us? And I think we all kind of, especially brown people, especially Muslims, I think we all suddenly had to like get into this melee, whether we liked it or not, because suddenly Islam was being represented, and Muslims around the world were being represented in a way that just felt completely ill-informed and reactionary and fear-based. And the government and the media were now using this as a tool with which to propagate fear, to create, to further agendas. 9/11 for a tragic, it was this tragic thing, and it was like there was so much suffering and there was so much all that, but it very quickly became a political tool, and it very quickly became like, okay, how do we use this to further an agenda that we've had, like the invasion of Iraq and the removal of Saddam, and and just the whole war on terror that just had now it just gave, it suddenly became this thing where and it continues to be, I think, to this day, Islamophobia and all of that is still a tool.